Hello, everyone. Welcome to Slash Film Daily. Today is Monday, October 7th, 2024. On today's episode of the show, we're going to be talking about the weekend's box office numbers. My name is Ben Pearson. I'm an editor at slashfilm.com, and I'm joined on today's episode by Slash Film staff writer and box office analyst, Ryan Scott.
Hey everyone, how's it going?
All right, Ryan, it's actually been since September 17th that you and I talked about box office on the show, if I have my dates correct. I was gone for a week and we've had a bunch of interviews and stuff like that running on the show. So let's get back into this. I guess before we talk about what just happened at the box office this past weekend, I wonder if you can run through maybe some of the highlights, the biggest box office stories of the past few weeks, just to kind of catch me and maybe our listeners up on the stuff in case we aren't paying attention to it as much as you are.
Yeah, totally. So let's first go over just we'll go through some bullet points over the past couple of weeks because I know what everybody's here and they want to hear about today. But some stuff has happened since we last talked. Last weekend, the Wild Robot topped the charts with just shy of like $36 million, which was a really pleasant surprise for non-franchise animation, and it has continued to do very well. A cinema score, like it's holding very well. It crossed 100 million worldwide already this weekend, so it's doing very, very well. And I loved the movie personally, so that's great to see. Um, One of the other bullet points we should talk about is that Francis Ford Coppola's Megalopolis opened to just $4 million last weekend. It fell off a cliff in this most recent weekend. It is probably not even going to make $10 million domestically. And it is a movie that cost $120 million to make. Now, that is all self financed by Francis Ford Coppola, so you can't really treat this like the average blockbuster that failed.
Mhm.
But it's not going to profit at all for Mr. Coppola. And the thing is, Lionsgate is only getting a distribution fee for it, so it's not necessarily something they're going to lose money on. On the one side, they're not going to make very much money, but on the other side of it, Lionsgate has now had a ridiculous run of bad luck at the box office. We had Borderlands, The Crow, this movie 1992 that I talked very briefly about, which got decent reviews and kind of just was dumped. The Killer's Game, Never Let Go, which has failed badly in the past couple of weeks. Megalopolis, and now in this most recent weekend, Whitebird, which was sort of a sequel to Wonder, which was a massive hit for them in, I believe, 2018. So Lionsgate is having a legendarily terrible year. And I try not to be overly mean, and I love Lionsgate. So this is all really like bad. and I'm
Yeah.
sorry to see that happening, but it needs to be pointed out that, the industry is sort of better off with Lionsgate in it, particularly as an independent player. And it is hard to imagine them being in a particularly good spot right now theatrically after all those flops. So, given that continued this weekend with Whitebird, it's certainly worth pointing out again that Lionsgate is having a really, really, really rough run right now.
Yeah.
So that's not great. Um,
Any other big moments that are big? I guess there weren't really. I kind of maybe I picked a decent time to leave in terms of the
you
end of
kind
the.
of did. The only other thing I would say is that unfortunately, Transformers One, despite having really good reviews, a cinema score, all that, just hasn't connected with audiences. It is really not going to do very well. It's probably not going to clear 200 worldwide. And, even though it only has a $75 million budget, and even though it's probably going to sell a bunch of toys or whatever, it really suggests that the Transformers franchises needs to be put on ice for a bit. It's just, even a very well reviewed movie for families for this, it just can't, like, I don't see a way forward right now. I'm not saying Transformers is dead forever, but I'm saying that, like, if this movie can't get the wheels turning, I don't know what can. Um,
Well, perhaps Transformers teaming up with GI Joe will be exactly what the Doctor ordered in this scenario, right? Because that's what Paramount's doing next, aren't they?
yeah, and yeah, hey, the GI Joe movies have done really well at the box office, famously, right? Right? Yeah, I don't know. That one bums me out. I'm actually finally seeing Transformers 1 tomorrow because I had Fantastic Fest, so I didn't get the chance to see it. But so yeah, so that's kind of, I guess, I'm sure there might be some stuff I'm missing, and I apologize to listeners who, might be But those are the big bullet points. Now, shall we get to what everyone wants to talk about?
Actually, before we do that, Ryan, why don't you just run through the whole top 10 of this past weekend at the box office? And then, yes, we will definitely be talking about Joker 2 because that is the big story right now. But give us some context. What does the rest of the box office world look like that Joker 2 entered into?
Great. Yeah. So let's do that and we'll have a lot to talk about. So I'm glad we're doing this now because the actuals just came in for the weekend. So often, I've said this before, we often talk about estimates, which are usually very close. Now, the actuals don't often change the narrative very much, but today they did. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So, Joker Folie à Deux, the sequel to 2019's Joker, DC's billion-dollar hit, made just $37.8 million in its opening weekend. And we will talk about why that is nothing shy of a catastrophe more in a minute. We'll talk more about the overseas numbers too. Coming in at number 2 was The Wild Robot, which I talked a little bit about, doing very well, taking in $18.7 million in its second weekend for just a 48% drop. Coming in at number 3, still holding strong, is Beetlejuice in its fifth weekend with $10.1 million, dropping just 37% from the prior weekend. It crossed $400 million worldwide this weekend, so good for Tim Burton and Warner Brothers on that one. Number 4 was Transformers 1. Despite not having a big opening weekend and despite things not being there altogether, it dropped just 42% with a $5.3 million third weekend. So, it might not profit overall, but audience are still showing up for that one. At number 5 was Speak No Evil. Again, another movie that kind of had a soft opening, but it has held really well in the weeks to come. It made $2.8 million on its fourth weekend and is approaching $70 million worldwide. So that one is actually going to do okay for Blumhouse in the end here. At number 6, something called Sam and Colby: The Legends of the Paranormal. It played on just 302 screens and made $1.7 million for an almost $6,000 per screen average. It played exclusively at AMC theaters, and AMC got a nice little win with that one. At number 7 was the aforementioned White Bird, which made just $1.5 million on just over 1,000 screens. Another whiff for Lionsgate. Number 8, finally winding down, is Deadpool and Wolverine, also with $1.5 million, dropping 45% from the prior weekend. Number 9, one of the big surprises this weekend, was The Substance, Mubi's latest body horror movie. It's over 2 hours long. It has a somewhat minimal marketing campaign, and most importantly of all, it lost 1,000 screen this weekend, but still made $1.3 million, dropping just 35% from the prior weekend on only 686 screens. So word of mouth is strong for The Substance. And at number 10 was Megalopolis, which dropped 74% in its second weekend for just over $1 million. A very lousy $566 per screen average for that one. Its run is pretty much over. So that's the top 10, folks. Shall we talk about the elephant in the room?
Yeah, before we get to that, one of the things that you said that you mentioned Beetlejuice, and while I was out, I got an email from a listener named Ben who wrote in and just said, just a brief thought I had listening to you and Ryan talk about Beetlejuice underperforming overseas. I know that many cultures have various beliefs and superstitions around the dead that are very different than the United States. Could it be possible that there is just a cultural disconnect about a film based around ghosts, demons, and the afterlife that is either confusing or possibly even offensive to international audiences? And I thought that was a great point. I feel like we've mentioned that in some other context around some other supernatural themed movies in the past, but I kind of like forgot that that was a thing. Like my US centric brain, kind of just forgot about that as a possibility. So yeah, just wanted to read that email real quick and say that that could have been a factor in Beetlejuice's overseas numbers.
100%. It's just that, and that applies to a lot of movies where just certain things are culturally more, aligned for certain audiences. Like there are movies like, The Battle at Lake Changjin, which is, a monster hit in China, but it is a very specific to Chinese culture war film. It's not going to really have much of an audience elsewhere. Now, that's a bit more of an extreme example, but that absolutely plays in with some of these things. And, if it's a very America-centric movie, you can't expect it to play overseas. And Beetlejuice has a bit more of a universal appeal. But the other thing I'd like to point out is that, and I think we talked about this on opening weekend, is Beetlejuice the original one didn't really have a big international rollout. so it was more of a domestic hit. So anyone that's discovered it over the years, it's been cable, home video, whatever. So that might have played in as well, but it's just a
Mhm.
range of factors, and that certainly should be something to be considered.
Yeah. Okay, let's take a break and then we'll come back and talk all about Joker Folie à Deux. All right, Ryan, let's get into it. Provide some context. Give me a framework for how to think about the severe underperformance of Joker 2 at the box office here.
Underperformance is I am normally a little tempered. Underperformance is not a strong enough word. This is a full-on flop, and it needs to be framed as such. So let's go over some basic numbers here. And this one has activated my I must admit, listeners, I might not be as even tempered as I normally am. This one upsets me. And I haven't even seen the movie. I'm going to put that on Front Street. I didn't see the movie. I cannot judge it for myself. I did not like the original, which we've talked about. But from a pure dollars and cents business perspective, I don't know how you let this happen. And let's talk about what is this? Well, the original Joker opened to $96.2 million in 2019. It's admittedly a very different time. But the movie went on to make over $1 billion worldwide and was the highest grossing R-rated movie of all time until Deadpool and Wolverine overtook that crown this year. Nobody ever expected the sequel to make as much as its predecessor. That was a lightning in a bottle situation. So I never was like, "Hey, let's make $1 billion." But the important thing to remember is that first film was a big risk at the time. It was R-rated, it was dark. So Warner Brothers budgeted accordingly. They said, "We're going to give you a $60 million budget, give or take, and we're going to let the DC branding serve as some sort of insurance policy for this film where it's hard to lose that amount of money on a film like this." So that's what they did. Turned out to be a gigantic moneymaker. Some have called it the most profitable comic book movie of all time, which is entirely possible. Okay, so then Todd Phillips comes back. They weren't contracted for a sequel, so you kind of get to demand the world at that point. Obviously, Phillips is going to want a big amount of money. Joaquin Phoenix is going to want a lot of money. Lady Gaga doesn't come cheap. Fair enough. This is not an effects heavy movie. This is not some movie where you have the third act and the world is blowing up. The budget for this movie is about $200 million. I've seen estimates as low as $190 million. Okay. Even with the increases in salary, I simply don't see how you get to that $200 million figure, but whatever. So now we're talking about a movie with a $200 million budget that just made $37.8 million domestically. Internationally, it's a little better. It did $81.1 million, but that's still well below the 152 international opening of the original. So it has a $119 million global start for a $200 million movie. That's the base numbers. That's terrible. Morbius, a movie that became an internet meme, made $39 million on its opening weekend in 2022. That's what we're talking about. That's how bad this is. Joker Folie à Deux opened lower than Morbius. So,
Wow.
that's the initial context. I have some more to say, but I'm open to some questions you might have here, Ben.
Well, I wanted to provide a little bit. I read, I think it was Matt Bellany over at Puck wrote that part of the reason why Joker 2's budget is so much higher than the first movie was because Todd Phillips did not want to shoot this film overseas. And I think there was I forget what the exact number was, but it was like tens of millions of dollars worth of difference in the budget because he demanded that it be shot in Los Angeles to make it more comfortable for him and presumably Joaquin Phoenix and whoever else that that factors into a decision like that. A lot of filmmakers chase production at different states or even in different countries based on tax incentives and stuff like that. It's pretty cheap comparatively to film something in London or the UK compared to Los Angeles, but obviously, like, comfort seemed to be the factor here or a factor here for Todd Phillips. So that I just wanted to mention that because I read that in a report and was like, oh wow, that's fascinating. You don't often hear. I guess I was going to say you don't really often hear details about that, but there aren't often box office disasters of this scale to to be paying
No,
this
where it
close attention
matters.
to. So
Right, and I need to provide further context here because we haven't even begun to talk about why this is so bad. Um, Joker Folie à Deux earned a historic D Cinema Score. Now, for those that don't follow Cinema Score, what it is a polling company that polls actual moviegoers on opening weekend, and based on their responses, you are given a cinema score. It is for the industry a very important tool because it often measures, it is one of the best tools we have to measure how well a movie will probably do, like legging out. For example, The Fall Guy earlier this year, even though it had a lousy opening weekend relative to its budget, it legged out shockingly well. Because it had a good cinema score and like audiences really liked it. It's a good indicator of word of mouth. No major studio comic book movie in history has earned a D cinema score ever. This is the first time it's ever happened. Madam Web, Morbius, all that, you can name anyone you want, that none of them had this happen. It's Rotten Tomatoes score, both critic and audience, continue to drop over the weekend, and it ended up at 31 and 33%, I think was the last time I checked. So we're talking bad, 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 bad.
Yeah. I think Cinema Score is, correct me if I'm wrong, but Ryan, but I think Cinema Score is like asking people who've just seen the movie if they feel like the marketing was an accurate depiction of the movie that they just saw. Like if they felt misled or something. Like I remember Drive, the Ryan Gosling movie, getting a bad cinema score because it was marketed almost like a Fast and Furious movie. And I remember somebody even like filing a lawsuit at that time saying like the trailer was false advertising because the movie is so much more moody and quiet and sort of intense than the sort of like all out action film that it was being sold as. But I think that's what Cinema Score measures. Is that
That's
correct?
part
Does
of
that
it.
sound
Yeah,
right to you?
I
Okay.
think they have a full like questionnaire that they ask, and that is part of it.
Okay.
And here's a little bit more context for you. So Joker Fall You Do earned $7 million in its preview screenings, which was about half of what the original made. So then Friday, those preview screenings get lumped into the Friday total. So the Friday total was $20.3 million, which was already very low. Here's what happened. The Saturday numbers were $11.3 million, meaning that it dropped 44% from the Friday grosses. Then the Sunday number was just $6.2 million, which was a further 45% drop from Saturday. You see the precipitous falling off a cliff day to day happening there?
Mhm.
So, what do you think's going to happen next weekend?
It's not going to be good. I'll tell you that.
Right. So, a very best case scenario right now for this movie, if it continues to somehow do better overseas than domestic, is that it's going to maybe get to 300 million worldwide. That includes China, which, as we've talked about, Warner Bros. Is only going to see about 25% of that money. So 300 million worldwide, absolute best case scenario for a movie that cost almost $200 million to make before marketing. This is going to be an absolute disaster. Now, okay, fine. If Warner Brothers wants to say we leaned into Todd Phillips' vision, whatever, blah, 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 that's fine. Then you say no at some point. You say you have to shoot it here to save money. You say this, you say that. You don't just write a blank check for something that was this clearly going to be divisive. Like they must have known what they had on their hands. No studio is this ignorant. So that's where I get a little frustrated. It's like how a studio like Warner Brothers lets this happen unchecked. It's the worst kind of business practice for this sort of thing. Whereas, the first Joker, as much as I don't like it, was kind of a, hey, this could be the future of comic book cinema, where you sort of give somebody money to test an interesting idea, and when it works, it works, and if you lose small. This was the complete opposite of that. So
Yeah, Ryan, I gotta say, I'm really torn about this. I have not seen Joker. I am not a huge Todd Phillips fan. I like some of his stuff. There's this real reveling in the um, slow motion train wreck that we're watching of this movie, basically just falling off a cliff in real time. And there seems to be people who are just taking absolute glee in this, probably because they don't care for Todd Phillips and whatever. Maybe they don't like Joaquin Phoenix for any number of reasons. I'm not sure why exactly this sense is, but if you just like look online or tap into film Twitter or something, you'll see a lot of people practically celebrating this. And I mean, on some level, I get it. Like, it's kind of obnoxious, the things that Todd Phillips has been saying, whatever. Like, I get that there's that sort of like gut level of like, I don't know, disgust that some people may have with the way that he's been handling the press rollout or whatever this movie. On the other hand, though, like I kind of like this is kind of a scenario that I want to see, which is a studio backing an artist and letting them realize their vision on the big screen in like the biggest way possible. Like that's the kind of thing that we fight for and that we champion and that we
Yes.
want to see.
Yes, but
So
that was the first movie. That was executed well on the first movie. I think my problem, because I completely agree with you, and I don't mean to interrupt, but my problem was letting it happen on this scale, knowing that what he had cooked up was not going to be what most people wanted or expected. So they had to have known, it was going to fall short in some way. You know what I'm saying? Like, you can't let it
yeah, I
happen on
do. I
this
mean,
level.
you said like that they know that it's not going to be what people wanted or expected. And even that, I kind of like, there's a really big part of me that is like, I want to champion that as well. I want to champion artists kind of pushing the boundaries and not just giving people exactly what they think they want. Um,
100%, but you can't do it for $200 million.
yeah.
That's my problem, is that you can't. Of course you make those. That's why you made the first Joker for 60. You can't, at $200 million, which very few movies should ever cost. I've said this before. You have to kind of make them for everyone. When you get to that $200 million budget level, you can't do, you know, you just,
Yeah.
I go back to, I wrote up this thing way before the release where Phillips was talking about the budget, and I was kind of on him for the budget early on, and people were giving me shit for it because the first movie made $1 billion. But I want to go back to this quote now because I think in hindsight it says so much. So Phillips was addressing reports over the budget, and this is what he said about it. He said, I read these stories and it seems like they're on the side of the multinational corporations. They're like, why does it cost so much? They sound like studio executives. Shouldn't people be happy that we got this money out of them and we used it to go hire a bunch of crew people who can then go feed their families? Come on, are we pretending that Phillips hired more gaffers because he got a $200 million budget? No, I don't think that that's the truth. And we're also talking about a man who's been very outspoken about being anti-union. I believe he, said some stuff about the writer's strike, and so I don't know. That all seems in hindsight like a little just frustrating to me, and I don't know. It this is hard for me to swallow. Because I agree with you, and I think as much as I hate the first Joker as a film, I loved what it represented for the possibility of comic book cinema. But you've got to do that stuff responsibly. $200 million is rarely responsible anyway, let alone letting this happen with that kind of money. Warner Brothers stock has dropped incredibly. This is like the 6th DC misfire in a row. We haven't even talked about what this means for, DC Studios, which we'll get to in a minute, but because I respect your sentiment and I really do. And that's why this frustrates me all the more that Warner Brothers let this happen on this scale and it really got away from them.
Yeah, and I think maybe it can't be overstated the fact that like just nobody really likes this movie. I mean, if you look at those Rotten Tomatoes numbers that you mentioned, which again, like I'm loath to even bring up Rotten Tomatoes, but I guess for the purposes of just a normal conversation that we're having, it serves as a decent enough shorthand anyway to just represent the fact that people are just not liking this film. So if you have something like, I guess just to go to the most obvious comparison point, like Martin Scorsese's Killers of the Flower Moon, just to bring Marty back into this conversation about superhero cinema once again. You have a movie like that cost an astronomical amount of money to make and didn't really perform super well at the box office because Apple has this whole separate structure of releasing movies and what it values and all of that. We talked about that when that movie came out. But that movie had very vociferous defenders. It had people that loved it. It had a critical community that was at it, that had its back basically. And Joker 2 does not. So I think that may be a big part of the reason why you're not seeing people make the points that I was trying to make of like, let the artists do their thing or whatever. Like it's tough to make those points when the end product is just not satisfying to people.
Right, and that's
And
the thing. It's exactly that. It's for nobody. Like critics largely, because again, I think after that first festival screening, it was hovering around like 62% on Rotten Tomatoes. All it's done is drop as more people have seen it. Both critical and audience. Like this is an example of, so just to give you the actual numbers, 33% critical approval rating, 31% audience rating on Rotten Tomatoes. Rarely are like critics and audiences that aligned on these sort of things. just for some further context, let's look at some other superhero movies people sort of hated. Morbius has a 15% critical approval rating, but a 71% audience rating. And Madam Web, a more recent one, 11% critical approval rating, but a 57% audience rating still. So, the fact that audiences have rejected it so roundly, and even critics, where you would maybe be able to say, like the first one, there were, it was a little divisive, but critics were largely on its side. That's just not the case here. And again,
Yeah.
that's why when you spend $200 million on a movie, like a studio like Warner Brothers, they know on some level, what to expect. And they must have known with the content of this film that it wasn't going to do $200 million movie numbers. So
Yeah.
that's where it's just bad business. But
Yeah, last thing on this, I saw that they also did not test screen the movie
yep.
at all, and that's another one where I'm kind of torn. Like, I think test screenings and studio notes and stuff get a really bad reputation, partially from outlets like Slash Film over the years. We've contributed to this as much as anybody else. Of like, again, wanting to stand by the artists and try to venerate their visions and not really, a lot of times you look at studio notes as like, oh, these suits don't know what they're talking about, and these people are more interested in math than they are in art and creativity and whatever. I think there is actually a strong case to be made, and many filmmakers have made it, that the test screening process is like incredibly invaluable to the process of getting the movie to the best version of itself. So the idea that they were just like, they completely opted out of that process for this film, I don't really know what to make of that. But again, just one more thing to sort of include in the swirl of stuff around this film.
Yeah, I have my own thoughts on that, but mostly that it was probably and again, this is speculation, this is guessing on my part. It was probably Todd going, it's my way or the highway, because he was able to demand that, and few filmmakers are ever in that position, right?
Yeah.
So, he had final cut, and so what? Like, what did test screenings do? If he goes, I don't want to test that, it is what it is. And then the other thing is, I think, not to circle back to, this is a studio that scrapped a Batgirl movie that was finished because they said it was too bad to release. So a $90 million movie that all these people poured their hearts into gets shelved for a tax write-off, but they will release this.
Mm-hmm.
That in hindsight, and I had heard, and I've said on this podcast to the chagrin of people like that, I had heard, and I have heard from that the Batgirl movie was not good, or at least the versions of it that was screened. Okay, so I've put that out there, but and I've never really defended that decision, but then that now is indefensible in light of this.
Yeah.
Like, okay, fine, if you're saying we're trying to protect the DC brand by not putting out a bad movie, but you put this out. So that's where this gets, like, this one angries the blood more than your usual box office flop for me.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Yeah, it's rough.
So you mentioned DC Studios, and so let's talk just a little bit about the future of that as we kind of bring this episode to a close. So what do you think this does for James Gunn and Peter Safran and their yet to be officially launched DC universe, which is the new reboot of basically all the DC stuff? I mean, this movie was not ever intended to be part of that experience, that timeline, that canon, that universe, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, what do you make of this, Ryan?
Yeah, so James Gunn and Peter Safran are the heads of DC Studios, which was launched in late 2022 with the initial slate announced in early 2023. And Gunn and Safran have said, everything will now occupy a shared multiverse from here on out. And that even includes stuff like, Matt Reeves' The Batman Part 2 and the Penguin series on HBO, and the upcoming Superman Christopher Reeves documentary, which is all stuff that, Gunn has been out there on social media talking about. He hasn't said a word about Joker, and so that's created some confusion, right? But what ended up happening is, Joker was not a DC Studios branded film, whereas even though there's some of the stuff like Penguin and some of this other stuff is. So Phillips had said prior to the release, he said, with all due respect to Gunn and Safran, this is kind of a Warner Brothers movie. That's them also wanting to be like, okay, Todd did his thing. Let Todd continue his thing. Basically to say, like, James Gunn had zero input. And then James Gunn took to threads addressing some stuff from fans saying, it is Joker for All You Do is not a DC Studios film. He also said Penguin is DC Studios and the Batman 2 is. All future films with DC characters will be DC Studios. So the good news here is that Gunn and Safran get to wash their hands of this. They get to move forward and say, Joker for All You Do was not us. In the same way that, there were, Fox X-Men movies coming out at the same time Marvel Cinematic Universe's movies were coming out, but, 2015's Fantastic Four isn't a stain on the MCU. So
Right.
if they can sort of, do some PR wrangling and position it that way, that's helpful. It's nice that they don't have to carry that forward, but because there isn't a distinct, cohesive DC universe right now, DC is just DC to your average moviegoer. And this is like another, thing in the wake of, Shazam, Fury of the Gods and Blue Beetle and Black Adam and these other things that didn't work. So it's both good, and it's very good that it is not a DC Studios movie, because from a PR standpoint that helps them a lot, but it still doesn't solve the problem of DC having a string of disappointments in a row that Gunn and Safran now have to try to change the narrative on.
Well, honestly, this is the best time that this could have happened. Can you imagine if this happened right after the release of the Superman movie? Because that would have gotten so much more attention from everybody of like, oh, wow, DC's relaunching with this new Superman. There's a new person cast. Because most people don't even know that movie's happening yet. There hasn't been a trailer. There hasn't been anything. It's only us sort of nerds who care about this stuff who've been tracking that movie so far. And a Superman movie is going to get huge. My parents are going to know about that movie. It's going to be a really, really, really big deal. Maybe Warner Brothers' biggest movie of next year. And so if this happened, if Joker 2 performed this poorly right after that or something, then that would have been, I think, just like catastrophic timing wise for whatever kind of marketing stuff that they were trying to do in terms of like getting the message out about a rebooted system and all that.
Yeah, and they already have to sort of, now sort of talk around, the string of flops and whatever, but the best thing that they get to say is this is new, this is new, this is different, this is new.
Yeah.
And they get to leave this all behind, and but they also get to take, hey, the Penguin is getting great reviews and might get some Emmys, and that's DC Studios. And Superman, the Christopher Reeve story, is a documentary with like 100% on Rotten Tomatoes that, whatever. Like, so they get to sort of take those, and it's very fortunate like they got to brand those as DC Studios stuff. And so yeah, I agree with you that it's good that it happened now, but it also does continue to add to the challenging narrative that DC's in a rut, and they have to convince audiences otherwise. So look, I could drone on about this all day, but it's bad. It's really bad, and anyone who tries to spin it as anything other than that to soften the blow is not your friend.
Works directly for Warner Brothers or something.
That's so, and I will be, I would like to think the listeners know that I try to be as even tempered as I can about this stuff and try to be fair about this stuff. This one, it needs to be emphasized just how bad this is. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, before we wrap up, I just wanted to, I know we spent a lot of time talking about Joker 2. Any other stuff from the top 10 that jumped out at you that you wanted to just put a capper on before we wrap it up here?
Well, the one thing, as I was reading down the top 10, if some of you might have noticed, I didn't list a single film other than Megalopolis that dropped 50% or more this weekend, despite most of these movies being in theaters for several weeks or more. And the one slight positive here is that just about everything else in the top 10 benefited from Joker underperforming, from The Wild Robot to The Substance. In that, R-rated stuff like The Substance and Speak No Evil was able to sort of, benefit from, okay, well, we heard Joker sucks, but we still want to go to the movies. Why don't we go see this? Mm-hmm. Or, Wild Robot, any of this other stuff. And so that in some way was a win for other good movies that are out there right now. So I think that like broadly was the one thing I'd like to point out. And, that was good. That was the other big standout, I think.
Cool. All right. Well, that's going to do it for today's episode of the show. You can find more about all of the stories that we mentioned on today's show at slashfilm.com. I will link to several things in the show notes, so you can check things out directly there. Slash Film Daily is published every weekday, bringing you the most exciting news from the world of movies and TV, as well as deeper dives into the great features you can find on the site. You can subscribe to the show on Apple, Overcast, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Send your feedback, questions, comments, concerns, and mailbag topics to us at bpearson@slashfilm.com. That's BPEARSON @slashfilm.com. Please leave your name and general geographic location in case we mention your email on the air. Don't forget to take a minute to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. That really helps us out a lot. Tell your friends about the show any way you can.